Hello, we are meeting with Professor Stephen Olsen for an interview regarding perspectives related to coastal management. We would like to thank you for accepting the invitation and for your attention and time. It's an honor for us to speak with one of the major reference in the area of integrated coastal management. Your participation will certainly contribute a lot to the formation of coastal management students at UNESP. Stephen is a major international reference and a pioneer in the integrated coastal management, with experience in theory and practice of the relationship between governance, ecosystem, and also ecosystem change, with a focus on conservation and respect for people. Stephen has also been working with leaders from countries around the world. Currently, he's director of the Coastal Resources Center at the University of Rhode Island. The professor has published more than 40 articles and several books covering important topics such as diagnosis, indicators, and also experience in coastal zone governance in theory and practice.
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I had spent time working with fishermen and going on fishing boats, and I wanted to have some kind of career that would enable me to continue doing that kind of work. And I thought that the answer was to become a marine scientist, an oceanographer. And so I went to a school of oceanography in Rhode Island. And I quickly found I'd made a very bad mistake. When I took courses in fisheries, it was not about people who make their living fishing or how they behave, why they do what they do, or fish. It was all mathematics. So I decided this is not a good idea, and I left. And I went back and I did some fishing in Ireland, which was very miserable in the winter. And then I just was offered a part-time job back at the university I'd been going to, the University of Rhode Island, to assemble scientific information for a newly created body called the And the thought was that as they developed one of the first coastal zone management plans and programs at the state level, that should be based on science. But I soon found that really didn't work either, that what you needed to do that was useful was to focus in on problems that coastal people cared about and then apply the science to those issues. So the science was, of course, essential, but it did not lead, it was not the primary driver of a coastal management process. Coastal management is, of course, about managing people and human institutions. And the biology is sometimes important and sometimes not relevant at all. So we had great difficulty in writing a coastal management plan that worked, that was actually implementable, and was solving problems, providing clarity, transparency in the decision-making process. That took us a long time, nearly 10 years. And just as that finished, I was asked if I'd lead an international program sponsored by the U.S. Government, AID, and I accepted. And that set me off on the next 20 years of work, which, as you said, was in various countries, but with quite a lot of work in Latin America, in Mexico, in Cuba, in Dominican Republic, in a lot of time in Ecuador, some time in Patagonia, but also quite a lot of time in West and East Africa and Southeast Asia. Well, I think that, like all things, especially in governance and management, problems evolve and change. What people think will be helpful, that too changes, which is why I've always defined coastal management as, above all, a process of learning. You're always learning. Things keep changing. And my view now is that what began as coastal zone management in the U.S. then became integrated coastal management and marine spatial management. It's all basically the same thing in the 90s. And then another way of looking at it more broadly, that's become ecosystem-based management. And I believe that coastal management, coastal zone management, or ICM, it was in the 70s and 80s an early expression of ecosystem management or ecosystem governance. That really, in that process, which is all driven by the idea of integration, is in ecosystem-based management in particular, they're very, very clear that the proponents of that approach is that you have to give equal attention to the environmental aspects of things and the societal aspects of things. That becomes then ecosystem when you put them together. I think that coastal zone management and even ICM is now not in favor the way it once was. I think people have found it very difficult and continue to find it very difficult to integrate in programs that deal with both development and conservation, or human well-being and environmental well-being. And the approaches taken in ICM, Integrated Coastal Management, I think work well. They take time, and I spend so much of my time thinking about how do you assess progress, because it's difficult to assess progress, but very, very necessary. So these ideas have evolved, but are still at the center of what we need to do. It's useful to focus on coastal areas, but I think the basic principles of coastal management or ecosystem-based management can be applied anywhere. The coasts have a lot of peculiarities, which makes sense that some people really focus on coastal As I get older, I worry less about coastal and think about global change and global governance. Yeah, that's where we get back to this idea of integrated, that you need to look at all the various potentialities, all the competing interests, competing uses, and conflicts. So there is, and has been for a long time, a short list of sort of the classical coastal management issues. Important habitats, protection, restoration of important habitats, shoreline processes, erosion, management of estuaries, which are highly productive and highly stressed, fisheries-related problems, particularly small-scale inshore fisheries. But all of those sorts of issues that still hold, that it's still very much with us, overshadowing that is the governance system and the condition of the society. And in many places, the extraordinary speed of change in coastal areas, which makes being a practitioner of coastal management a very tricky job. You have to try to manage several things at once, and when you do that well, you're a big hero, and people think it's wonderful. When you fail, of course, it's very different. And coastal areas are, as you've said, that's where the densest human populations are. That's where most of the infrastructure is. It's important for food supply. The world's biggest industry, at least until recently, is tourism. And most tourism is related to beaches. So lots and lots. And now we've got a whole new set of issues that you are going to deal with. You're going to deal with climate change. You're going to see whether we manage to keep global warming not above 1.5 degrees centigrade to the pre-industrial levels. That's a huge challenge. When you're my age, you may see sea level rise, maybe not 1, but more like 2, even 3 meters above what it has been. As the polar ice caps melt, and they're melting faster than anyone thought was possible, the rise in sea level is going to be dramatic. And the ocean acidification is a huge issue. Get at the very ecology of the oceans themselves and the base of the food chain if planktonic forms that have calcareous elements in their bodies may disappear. So the changes, the problems I had to deal with are really much easier than the ones you're going to deal with. You're going to have to deal with both, the sort of everyday, easy ones, but in the context of those big, scary ones. So whenever I get a chance to talk to people at the beginning of their careers, I say, yes, this is important. I want to help. Yes, this is a subject I've been thinking about a lot. And the basics are that I found it wonderfully helpful when I heard a talk about the Anthropocene. And that suddenly explained to me lots of things that I was seeing happening, but couldn't fit them all together. And when the Crutzen and Jarmer put together their paper, now must be nearly 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you got suddenly a coherent narrative that people after the ice ages entered into a period of extraordinary climatic stability that made agriculture possible. People developed. Then that was stage one, and industrialization then took off. And then great wars happened, and in those great wars, there was the urgent need of the fighting countries to integrate among industries. It became a very top-down governance system in Germany, in Japan, in England, in the US. Those were the main countries. After the war, and what I've lived in my life is phase two of the Anthropocene, which has been called the Great Acceleration. And indeed, that's what you see everywhere, that the number one priority is economic growth, economic growth, economic growth. And the problem is that economic growth has raised the standard of living for millions and millions of people. But the problem is the waste products. And one form of waste products is CO2 and methane, other greenhouse gases that are released by burning fossil fuels. So we've had this incredible boom that has gone on for all of my lifetime. I was born just after World War II, and here I am, a retired guy, and I see the Great Acceleration having to end. If we're going to give up what has driven the whole system since the beginning of the since the beginning of stage two, industrialization, then that's going to bring massive changes. We have to stop or slow down population growth. Above all, we have to change our behavior drastically from a consumption-driven, money-driven culture to something different. And I think that when we prepare people like you for careers, it can be useful, I hope, to talk about the changes that we're now going into as phase three, where instead of everything going up, up, and up, you see the picture, they're going to have to slow down and decline. There's no other way. We may and probably will come up with new technologies. There's a field called geoengineering, where you can fly airplanes up at the very top of the atmosphere and release metal filings or other things that will create a sort of umbrella over the earth. as happens naturally, if there's a big volcanic eruption, the same thing happens. And the temperature goes down. But playing with the ecology of the planet as a whole is very dangerous. We shall see. We shall see. I think the governance systems are going to have to get better integrated if we're going to have a positive future. I think that the values, the stories we have in our heads, the way we behave in phase 3 is just going to be very different, and you can see it coming. COVID, I would say, can be seen reasonably as an expression of phase 3. It's global. It requires changes in behavior. It spawns misinformation. It has come quickly politicized. I'm afraid we're going to see more things like that. And believing in I do as I do in a learning-based approach to all of this, we should be learning from COVID and saying, oh my God, when you had this wonderful technology, these vaccinations that appeared like a miracle, and then people say, no, we don't want to take it. We're afraid it's got some microchip in it that's going to do God knows what. I mean, people are so suspicious, and the trust has been lost. I mean, there have been other times in our history when trust in government and a basic consensus on what was real and what was not. So we can create that again, I think. But right at the minute, we're doing the opposite. And people like Trump, ex-President Trump, can do enormous damage. And they get copied by others. So is he an expression of phase 3? Yeah, I think he is too, because he's saying climate change is a joke. That even though he took COVID vaccinations, he said, I'm not going to ask other people to do that, and so on. I mean, personally, the first thing that I learned when I was 20-something years old and had this new job of translating science for politicians and managers. One of the first cases that I worked on was the reconstruction of houses on a very exposed barrier beach. And it was necessary to decide whether that should be regulated, and if so, how, and above all, why. And it was very clear from the science that rebuilding there was a very bad idea, socially, environmentally, economically, everywhere you wanted to look at it. But when my little team suggested that they should prohibit, the lawyers went crazy and said, no. This is private property. This is private property rights. We would have to pay endless compensation, which we don't have. So the science suddenly became less relevant. It was the existing policies and traditions of private property that drove what was done. And so we did a compromise, and some beaches were classified as undevelopable and others with all kinds of standards were allowed. But that was a very early lesson in the roles of science. One thing that's very important, and we've learned from such places as the Great Barrier Reef and Chesapeake Bay and other long-term programs, is that the science to help build and construct a management program must be science that is in the role in playing a part in problem solving. You have to really, or opportunities, but it has to be an issue-driven process. Very often science is put up, I see this still in proposals that I'm asked to review. You have a beautiful description of the environmental side of things, maybe some good stuff on economics, but that needs to be meshed with what are the governance problems, what are the traditions of governance in this place, how is power allocated amongst the business community, civil society, and government. Many proposals, most proposals, for example, those of the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, don't hardly touch those topics at all. It's all natural science, not a problem-solving, social, political process, which must be grounded in the best science you can find, but that's just part of the game. I think that the first thing is to be as ready as you can be. Things get really bad when people are ignorant and just do not know what's going on. And then a big storm comes, or sea level begins to inch up more visibly, and very often the reaction is, well, who do we blame for this? And why is this happening? And what should we do? I think it's really, really important to take what we know and package it so that you, working in central Brazil, you could say, okay, what are the issues here? How can we communicate the implications, the knowns and the unknowns in a way that's accessible, and build that into curriculum in schools, build it into the way we teach people to take courses like yours. It's going to be a long process. There's certainly no quick fix